We are going to be looking at Noah and the story of Noah in Genesis 6 and Genesis 9. You heard those two readings, and they kind of seem separated, but they're actually the front end and the back end of probably the most cataclysmic event ever to occur in human history, the great Noahic flood of judgment. It's a pretty familiar story if you've been around the church at all, the story of Noah and the animals going two by two and the rainbow at the end. And this is the second week in our series. So last week we saw Adam, this week is Noah, and the series is called Extraordinary, and the reason is because you start to see these people where the characters we're studying, like you look at the banners and you see names like Noah and Abraham and Moses and Joseph and Esther and Ruth and Solomon and David, and you're like, man, those are the Old Testament saints. Those are the Old Testament heroes of the faith. And in many ways that's true, but they're not really heroes like we think of them, because if you start looking deeply into their lives, things are not so pretty. Like you see at the end of Noah's life, he gets drunk and exposes himself. You see in Abraham, he's a coward and a liar. Moses is a stutterer and a stammerer. Joseph is so arrogant, so proud, so mouthy that his own brothers sell him into slavery just to shut him up. Esther is afraid to go and speak to the king on behalf of her people. Solomon is a sexual deviant. I mean, you go on and on. Why would we study these people? The reason is because these are very ordinary people, very ordinary lives, very ordinary struggles and issues, very ordinary sins, but they encounter, trust, and follow an extraordinary God. And that's the hope of this series. The great hope of this series is because the vast majority, almost everyone in this room, myself included, we're all very ordinary people. We're doing ordinary things, we live in ordinary places, and yet the Bible says God loves, He delights to show how extraordinary He is in the midst of very ordinary people. So Noah encounters this extraordinary God in really some extraordinary circumstances, some very extraordinary cultural circumstances. Look at the culture that Noah lives in. Look at verses 5 and 6. Chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. It says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, all the time. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." See, we kind of think sometimes like, man, our culture's kind of jacked up, kind of broken, kind of rebelling, running away, immoral. Noah's culture, every inclination of their heart was always evil all the time, so much so that God was sorry that he ever made human beings. That's a jacked up culture. That's a messed up culture. And this worked its way out in all kinds of ways, because sometimes we kind of tend to think like, oh, there's the sacred and there's the spiritual, and it was wicked because they were breaking some spiritual laws over here. But what you see is anytime an entire people or entire culture abandons God, runs from God, ignores God, rebels against God, decides that they will rule themselves, they're not just some ethereal spiritual consequences, they're real, practical, tangible, earthly, judicial consequences. So look at how this is played out. Look at verses 11 through 13. Listen for the repetition of these words: corrupt and violence, corrupt and violence. Verse 11, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence." It's corruption, violence. Noah lives in a crazy culture. And one of the things that God is showing Noah and showing us is that our God is bigger than our culture. Our God is bigger than our culture. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, I miss the good old days. I miss the old days when things were better and easier and people were nicer and more moral and they went to church more and they loved God more or whatever. But we need to have some biblical perspective on where culture has been. Look at Noah's culture, right? Every inclination of their heart is always evil all the time. God is sorry he made them. Our culture's not there yet. Look at the culture Jesus was born into. I mean, even the religious people, even the good people, so to speak, in Jesus' day were corrupt. They were self-righteous. They were judgmental. They were leading people astray. Look at the Apostle Paul. He plants churches all over the Mediterranean, all over the Greco-Roman world, places where they use young underage girls for cultic prostitution in worship services. And Paul says in Ephesians 5, it is it is shameful to even speak of the things they do in secret. Now those are some jacked up cultures. So Ecclesiastes 7:10 warns us against this and says, don't say, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. It's not from wisdom to ask this. So we need to have biblical perspective. We need to have historical perspective. If you are a Christian, you should know something about church history. You should have some Christian heroes. Read some biographies. One of my heroes is a man named Polycarp. He lived from about 80 AD to like 160 AD. He was a disciple of the Apostle John himself, and when he was 86 years old, he was arrested, and they said, he was a leader in the church, a bishop in the church. They said, you have to swear to Caesar, swear your allegiance to Caesar, not to Jesus, or we're gonna burn you at the stake. You know what Polycarp said? Kindle the fire. Kindle the fire. And they burned an 86-year-old man at the stake. Now that's a jacked up culture. You fast forward to the Reformation, and John Calvin, we think of him as a theologian, but really John Calvin was a church pastor in Geneva. He was a guy who trained hundreds of church planters to go back into France where there was persecution and plant churches. And he sent hundreds of men and their families back into France, planted churches there. You know what the average lifespan of a church planter, the late 1500s in France was? 6 months. 6 months before they were rounded up and executed. Now I wonder who we could get to plant our next Journey Church if that was the deal, right? I think the application process would be pretty quick. Late 1800s, one of my favorite guys, his autobiography changed my life. His name's John Patton. And John Patton decided he wanted to be a missionary, and he decided to go to the New Hebrides Islands, which we would know today as Vanuatu. But he goes to Vanuatu, and the problem with Vanuatu is no one ever gone there and come back because the island was filled with cannibals. And John Patton goes and takes his family and spends his life preaching the gospel to cannibals. That's a jacked up culture. And you say, yeah, but that was old days. We're more civilized and modern today. We don't have that kind of thing. Do you know that in the last year alone, over 170,000 women and men were martyred for their Christian faith? Just in the last year, over 170,000 were martyred for their Christian faith. And we will start screaming about persecution just when someone disagrees with us, when they make fun of us, when they disagree with our sexual ethics, when they put us down intellectually, when they want to remove a plaque or a monument. We start screaming persecution. God is bigger than our culture. Our God is bigger than our culture. Now, I'm not saying the air is not a little more acidic toward Christianity. It certainly is. I'm not saying it won't get worse. It certainly might. But we haven't reached the biblical and historical proportions of these cultures that I just described to you. Because the bottom line, doesn't matter what our culture is, what they do, because God is bigger than our culture. He's not up in heaven wringing his hands going, what am I going to do? How will I help? How will I reach these people? God is bigger than our culture. He is bigger than your sin. He is bigger than your weaknesses. He is bigger than your ordinariness because he is God. He is extraordinary. That's who he is. And so he's not surprised. He's not taken back. He's not worried. He is not afraid because he is bigger than our culture. That has been true throughout history. It is true today. The question is, do we believe it? Do we live it? Do we live and do we believe and do we talk and act as if he is? Because instead of withdrawing from and retreating from our culture, God is sending us on mission as missionaries to our culture, in our culture. He's giving us a mission to the culture. See, God, he didn't place us in some other time. He didn't place us in the good old days, whenever that was. He placed you on purpose, where you live, where you work, where you play, in your family. He did that on purpose. He did that with a mission. He did that with a strategy. It was a mission to the culture. You say, okay, that's what he did with Noah, right? He sends Noah as a missionary to this culture. Why Noah? Why did he choose Noah? Out of all those people, why did he choose Noah? We usually say, well, the answer is in verse 9, right? This is what verse 9 says. Noah was a righteous man He was blameless in his generation, and Noah walked with God. So Noah was the best of the bunch. He was the most moral. He was the most righteous. He was a good guy. Everybody else is a bad guy. So God said, who's the best guy? I choose Noah. That would be to get the gospel completely backwards. Because in the gospel, grace always precedes obedience. In the gospel, grace always precedes obedience. Grace always comes first. The gospel does not say, I obey and therefore I'm accepted. The gospel says, I am accepted by Jesus and therefore I obey. You say, well, where's that in Noah's life? Well, did you catch verse 8? Because as far as we can tell, Noah is just as much a part of this broken, messed up culture, every inclination of their heart's always evil all the time as everyone else. Then something happens in verse 8. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found favor. That word favor is grace. Noah found grace. He didn't create, he didn't obey it, he didn't earn it, he found it because God freely gives it. And what that tells you is Noah's part of that generation, and it tells you that God can reach down to the most wicked, dark, lost generations, cultures, places, and people and rescue and save and redeem. That's how vast his mercy is. That's what he does for Noah. Grace, if we want to be on mission, you have to get salvation. You have to be saved before you go on mission. You have to be drawn in before you're sent out. And grace always comes before, it always precedes obedience. But it is true that saving grace is always sending grace. There's always a mission. Saving grace is always sending grace. We're saved so that he can send us. And that's what he does here with Noah. So the earth is broken, it's violent, it is corrupt, and God says, Noah, I'm sending you. It's part of what our mission is as a church. We talk about we want to welcome outsiders in to meet Jesus, and then we want to send insiders out to follow Jesus on mission. God's mission strategy. You know what's God's mission strategy? God's mission strategy is you. God's mission strategy is the church. E.M. Bounds, who was a writer in the 1800s, he said this: men are God's method. And he says men, he means universally men and women. Men are God's method. We are searching for better methods, but God is looking for better men. Because he's sending us into and for the culture. So that's what he does with Noah. So he gets Noah, saves Noah. Now he's going to send Noah. And he goes, okay, Noah, I've got a plan. The whole earth is violent. The whole earth is corrupt. Everything is terrible and broken. I've got a plan. Great, Lord. What's the plan? I want you to build a boat. This is the great plan that God comes up with. This is the very next thing he says in verse 14. Therefore, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. This is the plan? Of all the violence and corruption, you want me to build a boat? Can we just admit that initially, very often, when God says things, when God commands things, they just seem odd. They just seem like they don't make sense. They're not practical. It seems old-fashioned. It seems silly. And we can see this all the way through, right? I mean, think about what I just said, that the church is God's mission strategy, right? You're like, seriously, the church? Have you seen the church? Do you know what the church is? Have you seen people there? I mean, do you see what some of the churches have done, some of the things? That must be, Lord, are you sure that I heard you right on that? But see, sending grace always involves trust. It always involves trusting God more than trusting our own wisdom, because God is not interested in all our pragmatic solutions. We see that in several other ways, right? Like God says, I want you to love and forgive and bless your enemies. Really? Like, are you taking crazy pills? Like, is that what you really said? And then he says things like, I want you to be conservative with your sexuality and promiscuous with your money. Like, wait, no, that's backwards, God. You got that the reverse. Like, our culture says the opposite. See, all these things that God says, it will always involve trust in him over human wisdom, over pragmatism, over what seems silly or old-fashioned or makes sense. And that's because Jesus is not interested in human strategies and human wisdom. Psalm chapter 40, verse 4 says this, "Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who doesn't turn to the proud." You're not trusting in human wisdom, you're trusting in the Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25 says, "The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." The most foolish thing God could ever do is wiser than men, and the weakest thing God can ever do is stronger than men. Because human activity never built the church. Human activity never created. The church was never built on, it was always built on Jesus and on His grace. That's why Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this. He says, "It is not we who build the church. Christ builds the church. Whoever is mindful to build the church is surely on his or her way to destroying the church. Therefore, we must confess He builds. We must proclaim He builds. We must pray to Him, and He will build." Church is not built on human wisdom. Now, how did that work out in Noah's life? The sending grace involved trust, right? So think about it. Noah's going to build this ship. The ship is 450 feet long, the Bible tells us. 450 feet long. It's the biggest ship that had ever been built to that point in all of history. And guess what? There are no cranes. There's no lumber mills. There's no saws, no electricity. Noah cannot make a run to Home Depot and get this thing done. This is going to be hard. It takes Noah over 100 years to build this ship. By the way, it's not near water. Noah is building a ship, and it's not like it's sitting on the Mediterranean Sea ready to be launched. It's not near water. So for 100 years, can you imagine how much trust he had to have as he builds? Blood, sweat, and tears, and how many jokes went around about him and his sons and their wives and how goofy they were, building this giant ship in the middle of nowhere. For 100 years, Noah trusts, and trusting the Lord always looks like obedience. You see that's emphasized throughout this passage 4 times. Chapter 6, verse 22. Noah did all God commanded him. Chapter 7, verse 5. Noah did all the Lord commanded him. Chapter 7, verse 9. 2 by 2, male and female, went to the ark with Noah as God commanded him. Chapter 7, verse 16. Those that entered the ark, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him. It always looks like obedience. So Noah is working over 100 years, and you know what he had to rely on? What was he trusting for that over that century? What was he trusting? He didn't have the Bible. He didn't have the cross. He didn't have a church to support him. He had one thing. He had the bare word and promise of God. God had said to him in chapter 6, verse 18, "I will make a covenant with you. I'll promise you. I will protect you and your family, but this is your task." All he had was the bare word and promise of God. It was God's promise, God's word that sustained him through all that time, all that suffering. It was his obedience. The obedience was showing the world who God was for over 100 years. You know what this is telling us? What this is saying to us, and maybe no one has ever said this to you. What this is saying is, your life matters. Your life was not a mistake. You were built, made by God, for God. Your life matters. Your obedience matters because a watching world is looking on. What is the message that you are preaching? What is the sermon that you are preaching? Noah had this weird task of the ark because that obedience is supposed to point to God. See, obedience, it's for Noah, but it's not about Noah. When we obey, it's for us, but it's not about us, right? You remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5? He said that we are to let our light shine before men so that people will see our good deeds, our obedience, and what? Give glory to God the Father. See, it's for us, but it is not about us. And God is using Noah's obedience as a visual demonstration. So every day, every month, every year, every plank that goes into the ark is a visual cue, a visual demonstration to the whole world, the whole culture around, that God's judgment is real, that God's judgment is coming. But even more than that, see, the ark is going to be the means of salvation for his family, right? And so it's not only a mark, it's not only a visual demonstration that God's judgment is real, God's judgment is coming, but it's a mark and a demonstration that though his judgment is great, his grace is greater still. That though his judgment is real, salvation and redemption and freedom are still possible. That God is still putting that on offer. In fact, think about 1 Peter 3:20 tells us that in the days of Noah, God's patience waited. Right? I mean, it's a corrupt culture, it's violent, and God could just strike them down in one moment, but instead he waits over 100 years while Noah builds this thing, a visual demonstration, my judgment, but my mercy is greater than my judgment. For over all this time period, God's patience is waiting and restraining. He's restraining himself. But if you know the story, no one else gets on with Noah. But I think what Noah shows us is that God is calling us to deal with the idol of our own respectability. See, do I want to be liked and respected more than I want to be obedient? Or am I willing to risk my reputation or looking unintelligent or whatever it is in order to lay out the gospel, to talk about my beliefs with my friends, family, and neighbors? Noah shows us that grace enables us to deal with the idol of our respectability. So no one gets on with him. Whole time building. Chapter 7, verse 11, the flood begins to come. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day, on that day, all the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were open, and rain fell on the earth 40 days, 40 nights. And on the same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons, with them entered into the ark. Verse 15, they went into the ark with Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. That's where you see all the pictures, the 2 by 2, male and female animals going into the ark. And for whatever reason, because there's animals and there's a rainbow, like we turn this into the premier children's story, even though it's like about a flood and wiping away people. And so I don't know why we've done that. We did. I digress. Verse 16. Those that entered the ark, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. The Lord tucks them in. The Lord is the one that closes the door. And the flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. What you would see is if we kept reading and pulled out all the time frames and all that kind of stuff, is that this narrative, Moses writes the book of Genesis, and he writes it in a very highly constructed literary way. And what he's showing us is that when the flood came, there were 250-day periods. 150 days where the flood happened and remained on the earth, and then 150 days where the flood abated and receded from the earth. There's more time in there, and so all in all, they spent 1 year on the ark. Now, can you imagine being locked in a boat for a year with your family, your in-laws, and like thousands of animals? I'm sure they were hoping for the Titanic to occur at any point. By the end, it was all grace, just getting off. So it was 150 days on the front side and 150 days on the back side. And then there's one little statement right in the middle of those 250-day periods, the center verse of the passage, chapter 8, verse 1. Chapter 8, verse 1 says, "But God remembered Noah." But God remembered Noah. You say, what do you mean? Did he forget? Like he forgot he had him on that boat and what was going on? And God doesn't forget like we forget. He's not talking about like losing your keys, remembering where they are. Whenever the Bible will often talk about God remembering, and whenever the Bible talks about God remembering, it's talking about him acting. For God to remember means for him to act on a previous promise. For God to remember means he's going to act on a previous promise. He's not just remembering he made a promise, he's ready to keep the promise. So he's looking at Noah, he's like, I'm going to act on your behalf. The flood is going to recede, I'm going to send you and your family out, and you'll be fruitful, and you will multiply. God remembered Noah. So all of this story is not ultimately about flooding, it's not about judgment, it's not even about Noah, it is about God. God is the hero of the text, and his memory to act on behalf of his people. He says, God remembered Noah. You've ever been forgotten? Ever felt forgotten? Ever been ignored? God does not forget. He remembers his promise, he remembers his people, and he acts on that promise. Now, what is it he remembers? He remembers Noah, but what else does this text say he remembers? It says he remembers his covenant. Chapter 6, verse 18 mentioned the covenant. We get to chapter 9 now, verse 7. They've come off the boat. And he says, be fruitful and multiply. Where did we hear that before? Adam and Eve, right? Genesis chapter 1, covenant of creation. Be fruitful and multiply. He's recreating. The flood decreates the earth, and now God is recreating the earth. Verse 8, God said to Noah and his sons, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you. Verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. He remembers his covenant. Now, what is a covenant? Because it's a biblical word, but it's kind of Christian jargon. You don't use it very much in our culture. In the Bible, the covenant, when it talks about God's covenant, the covenant is the indestructible promise of enduring relationship. When God makes a covenant, it's an indestructible promise of enduring relationship. He said, I've made this promise, it is indestructible, and I will always keep it. Our relationship will always be together. Notice it's not a bargain. You can't bargain with God. You can't come to God and be like, I'll do this if you do this. You can't come to God and say, well, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be obedient in this, but you got to work this scenario out for me and make this all fit. God does not bargain. He is God. But he does something way better. He covenants, he promises, and he remembers. He remembers and he acts on his promise. That's what he did for Noah. That's what he does for us. And if you notice, who's this covenant with? He told us in verse 9 and 10. He said, I establish my covenant with you, your offspring, that's your kids, and with every living creature, the birds, the livestock, every beast, all of the earth. Verse 13, my covenant is between me and the earth. God is included in his covenant, not just people, not just saving souls. He's included us, our children, and all of the earth. I would submit to you, Christianity is the only religion that has this kind of earthly, spiritual trajectory, that God is, because a covenant relationship is always a saving relationship. So he's saying, I'm going to save the earth. The earth hasn't sinned, he's saving it from our sin. Now that has massive environmental stewardship, implications. That's a whole nother sermon. But basically he's saying, my covenant is with you, but it's with the whole earth. One day everything I've made, I will renew you, your bodies, I will renew the earth, I will renew the physical creation, everything I will bring back to its perfect and right intention. The covenant is with all. Now, what's the sign of the covenant? What's the sign of Noah's covenant? Look at verse 13. You probably know this from some period in time, but verse 13 says, I have set my bow in the cloud. What's the bow? The bow's the rainbow, right? I've set my rainbow in the cloud. The rainbow is the sign of Noah's covenant. The sign is a symbol, it's a seal, it's a demonstration of what the covenant actually is, what the content of that covenant is. So if anybody's here and you're going, you know what, I'm wrestling with becoming a Christian. I think I might want to become a Christian. I don't know if I am a Christian. If you're wrestling with, how do I tell my friends about becoming a Christian? How do I renew my faith as a Christian? It's in the rainbow. What does the rainbow teach us about God's covenant? The first thing you see about the rainbow, right, is the rainbow comes after the storm. You don't ever get a rainbow on a sunny day. Rainbows always come after a storm. The first storm is, of course, the storm of our sin and our rebellion. That's what brings the flood. That's what brings the storm. But there are many other storms in life. Suffering, pain, disappointment, loneliness, death, The rainbow always comes after the storm. See, what it's saying is the storm can come. And the storm might harm and rage and destroy, but the storm always ends. There's always a calm after the storm. There's always the rainbow that comes after the storm. Every storm eventually expends all of its energy, but God's grace can never be expended. Every storm will eventually spin out, but God's grace never dies. So the rainbow always comes after the storm. He's saying, are you in a storm right now? The storm of figuring out for the first time your own sin? Or the storm of pain and suffering and difficulty in life? The storm will end. The storm will not have the last word. The rainbow always comes after the storm. But then the rainbow points to grace as well, right? The rainbow points to grace because if you look at the word in verse 13, it doesn't say rainbow. It just says bow. Why not? Because the word in Hebrew is not rainbow. The word in Hebrew is bow and arrow. Like, you know how a rainbow is shaped, right? Like a bow and arrow. The word in Hebrew is battle bow, war bow, God's own weapon. And what does he say? I've laid it in the sky. I've set it up. I've put it aside. I've put it away. I put away my wrath. I put away my weapon because there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. See, where's the bow pointed? How's the rainbow shaped? It's not like this, right? If it was like this, it was like pointed down toward us. Like that would be freaky. Rainbow is pointed up toward heaven. The rainbow is a sign of the covenant that one day the true arrow of God's judgment will find its true mark in the heart of God himself, in his own Son on the cross. How can God lay up his bow of wrath? It's not because he's no longer God of judgment. He doesn't stop being a God of judgment. He doesn't stop having judgment. He redirects his judgment. He no longer punishes us. He has put his judgment upon his Son. As one pastor said, Jesus got the lightning so that we could get the rainbow. Jesus took the lightning so that we could get the rainbow. The rainbow is the beautiful sign of Noah's covenant. All the covenants have a sign. And in a few moments, we'll celebrate communion. And that's the sign of the new covenant. Jesus' body broken, his blood poured out. Because what we see in Noah is, right, the water for many was the means of judgment. But for Noah and his family, it was the means of salvation. And we look at the cross. For Jesus, the cross was God's means of judgment. But for us, it is our means of salvation. And that's why Paul says, I came to know nothing among you but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Jesus got the lightning so that we could get the rainbow. So if you're wrestling with, I want to become a Christian. How do I become a Christian? How do I tell my friends to become a Christian? It's all in the rainbow. You got to admit, you caused a storm. Your rebellion, your sin caused a storm. But that's not the last word. There's a rainbow coming after the storm, the rainbow of God's grace. And you see the promise of where it points. It points up into heaven because Jesus took our judgment. He paid our sin. You believe that promise. You rest in that promise. You trust in that promise. And then you live a life of beauty like the rainbow, a life of beauty and grace and gratitude and mission. Because God is bigger than our culture. He sends us on mission to our culture because he is a God of salvation who is saving men and women day and night in and outside of our culture. He is a God of rescue and salvation. Jesus took the lightning so we could get the rainbow.